The only Bible passage ignored even by the wisest people on earth. There is a passage in the Bible that almost everyone has read, many have quoted, and yet very few have truly faced. Not because it is hidden, not because it is written in a way that requires deep study, but because the moment its meaning becomes clear, it begins to demand something most people are not prepared to give. This is not about a lack of knowledge, it is about a quiet and deliberate distance. You can sit in places of teaching, listen to sermons, read books, follow voices that speak with authority, and still never truly encounter this passage in its raw form. Not because it is absent, but because it is often softened, reframed, or surrounded by interpretations that make it easier to accept without actually confronting what it requires. And that is where things become unsettling. Because the more someone grows in knowledge, the more refined their understanding becomes, the more subtle this avoidance tends to be. It is no longer about rejecting truth outright. It becomes about navigating around it with precision, using language, theology, and reasoning to keep it at a safe distance. So the issue is not whether people know this passage exists. The real issue is what happens when they realize exactly what it means. Because this is not the kind of message that simply adds something to your life. It challenges the foundation of how you see yourself. It does not ask for agreement, it exposes contradiction. It does not invite admiration, it calls for transformation. And if you are paying attention right now, there is already a tension building. A quiet awareness that something deeper is about to be revealed. Not something new, but something you may have seen before and never fully allowed to reach you. That subtle resistance you feel is not sluchiny. It is the same resistance that has caused even the most disciplined, the most devoted, the most respected individuals to step carefully around this truth. Because once you truly see it, you cannot unsee it. Once you truly understand it, you cannot pretend you do not. And once it becomes real, it begins to ask a question that cannot be ignored. Are you willing to face a truth that does not adjust to you, but requires you to change? Stay with this, because what comes next will begin to expose why this passage has remained in the shadows, not by accident, but by choice. The silence that hides a forbidden truth. There is a pattern that unfolds quietly across time, so subtle that most people never stop to question it. Certain words are repeated constantly, certain teachings are emphasized, certain ideas are brought forward again and again until they become familiar, comfortable, almost automatic. But at the same time, there are truths that seem to exist just outside of that spotlight. They are still there. They have not been removed, they have not been denied, they have not even been argued against. And yet, they are rarely placed at the center of attention. This is not sluchinist. This is selection. Because when a truth has the power to disrupt not just behavior, but identity, it does not need to be attacked in order to lose influence. It only needs to be ignored long enough for people to stop engaging with it deeply. And that is exactly what happens. Over time, a kind of unspoken agreement forms. People begin to gravitate toward what affirms them, what reassures them, what allows them to grow without feeling dismantled. Teachings that inspire are embraced. Messages that comfort are amplified. Ideas that align with personal expectations are repeated until they feel like the full picture. And slowly, almost invisibly, the more demanding truths begin to fade into the background. Not because they lost meaning, not because they became outdated, but because they never stopped confronting something essential in the human heart. This creates a form of spiritual selectivity that feels natural, even wise. It allows a person to remain engaged, to feel like they are progressing, to believe they are aligned with truth while quietly avoiding the very thing that would require the deepest level of change. And the most striking part is that this does not only happen among those who know little, it happens even more precisely among those who know a lot. Because knowledge, when combined with self-preservation, becomes incredibly effective at creating distance without appearing to do so. It can reinterpret, reframe, and reposition truth in a way that removes its sharpest edges, leaving behind something that can be understood, discussed, even admired, without ever being fully lived. And that is where the silence becomes most dangerous. Because it is not loud, it does not announce itself. It simply exists, shaping perception, guiding attention, determining what is seen and what is passed over. The passage we are about to uncover lives inside that silence, Not forgotten, but consistently stepped around. Not unclear, but quietly avoided. Not weak, but carrying a weight that most people, even the wisest, hesitate to carry. And now that you can see this pattern, even if just slightly, the next question begins to press in with greater force. If silence can hide truth this effectively, what else have we learned to avoid without even realizing it? The illusion of comforting wisdom. There is a kind of wisdom that feels right the moment you hear it. It flows easily, it reassures, it organizes your thoughts without disturbing your sense of control. It gives you clarity without demanding sacrifice, direction without requiring surrender, and because of that, it is often mistaken for truth in its highest form. But not all wisdom transforms. Some wisdom protects. It protects the image you have built of yourself. It protects the version of faith that allows you to remain unchanged while still feeling aligned. It protects the internal structures that keep your life predictable, manageable, and above all, comfortable. And this is where the illusion begins. Because the more refined this kind of wisdom becomes, the harder it is to recognize that it is incomplete. It sounds deep, it feels grounded, it can even be supported with language that appears spiritual and authoritative. But beneath all of that, there is a quiet negotiation happening. A negotiation that says you can grow as long as you do not have to confront everything. This is not something people consciously decide. It happens gradually. You begin to favor interpretations that resonate without disrupting. You lean toward teachings that expand your understanding, but leave your core untouched. You learn how to engage with truth in a way that informs you without exposing you. And over time, this becomes your standard. You begin to equate clarity with comfort. You begin to trust what feels balanced, what feels reasonable, what fits within the boundaries you have already accepted. And anything that steps beyond that begins to feel excessive, extreme, or unnecessary. That is the moment where true wisdom starts to be filtered. Because real truth does not always arrive in a way that feels safe. It does not always affirm your current position. It does not always align with what you have learned to accept. In many cases, it does the opposite. It interrupts, it challenges, it confronts. And when it does, the instinct is not to reject it outright, but to reshape it into something more acceptable. Something that can coexist with your current life without requiring a fundamental shift. This is how even the most sincere individuals can remain distant from the very truths they claim to follow. Not because they lack intelligence, not because they lack access, but because they have learned, often unknowingly, how to engage with truth selectively. And the passage we are moving toward does not allow that. It does not adapt to your comfort. It does not adjust to your preferences. It does not offer a version of itself that can be integrated without consequence, which is why it is so often surrounded by interpretations that soften its impact. Because without that, it would force a level of honesty that very few are prepared to face. And now the tension deepens. If wisdom can be shaped to protect you from truth, how do you recognize the moment when you are no longer following truth, but managing it? The invisible pattern of spiritual avoidance. There is a pattern that does not announce itself, yet it repeats with remarkable consistency. It does not depend on age, knowledge, or level of faith. It moves quietly through thoughts, decisions, interpretations, shaping the way people engage with truth without ever making its presence obvious. You do not notice it when it begins. It starts in small ways. A passage that feels too direct is quickly reframed. A teaching that challenges too deeply is placed aside for later. A moment of conviction appears, but instead of being followed, it is analyzed, explained, and eventually diluted. Nothing is denied. Nothing is openly rejected. Everything remains technically accepted, and that is what makes this pattern so difficult to detect. Because on the surface, everything looks aligned. The language is correct. The beliefs are intact. The appearance of faith is present. But underneath, something subtle is happening. A quiet redirection away from anything that would require immediate and irreversible change. This is not rebellion in its obvious form. This is refined avoidance. It becomes more sophisticated as understanding grows. Instead of turning away from truth, you begin to manage your exposure to it. You decide how far it can go, how deeply it can reach, how much it is allowed to affect you. And this is where even those who are deeply committed begin to drift without realizing it, because the pattern does not remove truth from your life. It simply keeps it at a distance where it can be observed without being lived. You can speak about it, you can explain it, you can teach it, but you never fully surrender to it. And over time, this creates a dangerous stability, a place where you feel grounded, where everything seems consistent, where your faith appears mature, yet the very areas that require the most transformation remain untouched. Not because they are unknown, but because they have been skillfully avoided. This pattern does not create immediate discomfort. It allows you to move forward, to grow in certain ways, to deepen your understanding. But it also ensures that the most confronting truths never fully take hold. And that is why it is so effective. Because it does not feel like avoidance. It feels like progress. And now something begins to shift. Because once you recognize that this pattern exists, you can no longer assume that your engagement with truth has been complete. You begin to question not only what you believe, but how you have been interacting with what you believe. And that leads to a more unsettling realization. What if the issue has never been about not knowing what is right? What if the real issue is what happens after you understand it? When understanding does not lead to obedience, there is a moment that almost everyone reaches, though few recognize it for what it truly is. It is the moment when understanding is no longer the problem. The message is clear. The meaning is undeniable. The implications are fully visible. And yet, nothing changes. This is where the deepest tension begins. Because as long as something feels confusing, there is always space to delay. You can study more, reflect longer, seek additional perspectives. But when clarity arrives, that space disappears. What remains is a decision. And this is where many step back without realizing it. Not by rejecting what they understand, but by separating knowledge from action. They allow truth to settle in the mind while keeping it from reaching the will. They agree with it, they affirm it, they may even defend it, but they do not move with it. And over time, this creates a silent divide, a divide between what is known and what is lived. This is not always intentional. In fact, it often feels reasonable. Life is complex. Timing matters. Circumstances are considered. And within all of this, obedience is slowly postponed, reshaped into something less immediate, less absolute. But truth does not operate within those adjustments. When something is revealed with clarity, it carries an expectation that does not weaken over time. It does not fade. It does not adapt to your pace. It remains, pressing quietly, consistently, waiting for alignment. And the longer that alignment is delayed, the more something begins to shift internally. Sensitivity decreases, conviction softens. What once felt urgent becomes optional, and this is the danger. Because at that point, the issue is no longer misunderstanding. It becomes resistance that has learned how to disguise itself as patience, wisdom, or discernment. You begin to believe you are being careful, when in reality, you are holding back. You begin to feel balanced, when in reality, you are divided. You begin to trust your process, while quietly avoiding the moment that would require full surrender. This is why understanding alone is never the goal. There is a difference between seeing truth and submitting to it. One informs you, the other transforms you, and the passage we are moving toward does not leave space between those two. It does not allow you to remain in agreement without movement. It does not accept acknowledgement without response. It closes the gap between knowing and doing in a way that feels immediate and unavoidable. Which is exactly why it is so often approached carefully, cautiously, and sometimes from a distance. Because once that gap is removed, there is no place left to stand without making a choice. And now the pressure increases. If you already understand more than you have applied, what exactly has been holding you back? The passage that disarms every defense. There is a point where everything you have built to protect yourself begins to lose its strength. Not because it is attacked, not because it is exposed by argument, but because something greater simply renders it unnecessary.
This is the nature of the passage you are about to face. It does not come with complexity. It does not rely on layered interpretation. It does not require historical reconstruction or linguistic depth to be understood. Its power is found in its simplicity. And that is precisely what makes it impossible to escape. Because when truth is simple, there is nowhere to hide. Listen carefully to the weight of these words, found in the book of Luke, chapter 9, verse 23.
If anyone wants to come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross daily, and follow me. There is no ambiguity here, no conditions to negotiate, no space to reinterpret the demand. This is not an invitation to admire, it is a call to abandon something fundamental. To deny yourself is not to improve yourself, it is not to refine your behavior or adjust your priorities. It is to confront the very center of your will, your desires, your sense of control, and to place it under something greater. And this is where every defense begins to collapse. Because most people are willing to change parts of their life. They are willing to adjust habits, correct mistakes, pursue growth. But this passage does not speak about partial change. It speaks about surrender at the deepest level. To take up your cross daily is not symbolic comfort. It is a decision that must be renewed continuously. It is not about a single moment of commitment, but a consistent posture that affects every choice, every reaction, every direction you take. And to follow means more than agreement. It means movement. It means alignment. It means leaving behind anything that cannot continue on that path. This is why the passage is so often approached with caution. Because once it is seen clearly, it removes every excuse that allows you to remain divided. It does not allow you to hold on to control while claiming devotion. It does not allow you to stay where you are while believing you are moving forward. It brings everything into focus with a clarity that is difficult to resist and even harder to accept. And in that moment, something becomes undeniable. The issue is no longer whether you understand what is required. The issue is whether you are willing to let go of what stands in the way. And now that these words have been spoken, not softened, not adjusted, but presented as they are, something shifts again. Because once a truth like this is fully seen, the next instinct is almost automatic, to find a way to make it easier. The truth that refuses to be softened. The moment a truth becomes too clear, the natural reaction is not always rejection. It is adjustment. It is the quiet attempt to reshape what was heard into something more manageable, something that can fit into the life you already have without requiring you to rebuild it entirely. And this is exactly what happens with a passage like this. It is not denied, it is reinterpreted. People begin to shift the focus. Denying yourself becomes symbolic rather than literal. Taking up the cross becomes a metaphor for difficult moments instead of a daily surrender of control. Following becomes agreement instead of obedience. Each word is gently moved, carefully repositioned, until the weight of the message is reduced without appearing to be altered. And the most dangerous part is that this process feels intelligent. It feels thoughtful. It feels spiritually mature, because it uses reasoning, context, and language to justify why the original intensity might not apply in the same way anymore. It creates explanations that sound balanced, that seem responsible, that allow a person to remain engaged without feeling overwhelmed. But truth does not lose its weight just because it is explained differently. It remains what it is. And deep down, there is always a moment of recognition, a quiet awareness that what is being created is not clarity, but distance, not understanding, but protection. Because if the passage is left untouched, if it is allowed to stand in its full meaning, it demands something immediate. It does not leave room for gradual adjustment or partial alignment. It calls for a shift that is direct and personal, and that is where resistance begins to take a more subtle form. Instead of saying no, the mind begins to negotiate. It searches for ways to maintain control while appearing to surrender. It looks for interpretations that preserve identity instead of confronting it. This is not a lack of sincerity. It is the instinct to survive internally without losing the structure you have built over time. But this passage does not cooperate with that instinct. It does not bend. It does not adapt. It does not offer a reduced version of itself to make acceptance easier, which is why so many versions of it exist that sound similar but feel lighter, less demanding, less urgent. And yet, beneath all of that, the original words remain unchanged, waiting, unmoved, unaffected by how they are presented or explained. And at some point, every explanation reaches its limit. Every softened version begins to lose its ability to satisfy, because something inside recognizes that the truth has not actually been faced. And when that moment comes, the focus shifts again, because now it is no longer about the words. It becomes about you, the direct confrontation with the hidden self. There is a place within you that rarely gets questioned. It operates quietly, consistently, shaping your decisions, your reactions, your priorities. It is the center from which everything flows, and most of the time, it remains protected, unchallenged, even justified, until a truth like this reaches it. Because this passage does not stay on the surface. It does not deal only with behavior, habits, or external actions. It moves inward, past what can be seen, and confronts what has been guiding you all along. Your will, your desires, your need for control. This is where things become deeply personal, because denying yourself is not about rejecting who you are on the outside. It is about facing the version of yourself that insists on being in charge, the part that decides what is acceptable, what is reasonable, what is worth surrendering, and what must be preserved. And that part does not give up easily. It has learned how to survive in every environment. It can adapt to spiritual language. It can align itself with religious structure. It can even appear devoted while quietly maintaining control beneath the surface. This is the hidden self, not visible in words, not exposed in public, but active in every private decision. And when this truth reaches that level, something begins to resist in a way that feels different from anything before. It is no longer intellectual. It is no longer theoretical. It becomes internal. You begin to feel the tension between what you know and what you are willing to release. Because now the question is no longer about understanding the passage. It becomes about whether you are willing to let it reach the deepest part of you without interruption. And that is where most people step back. Not because they do not believe, but because they recognize what is at stake. Control is not something easily surrendered. Identity is not something casually redefined. The idea of letting go at that level creates a kind of internal friction that is difficult to explain, but impossible to ignore. So instead of confronting it directly, many learn how to redirect the focus. They return to external expressions. They emphasize visible actions. They invest in areas that can be managed without exposing what lies beneath. And in doing so, they maintain a version of alignment that never truly reaches the core. But this passage does not stop at the surface. It continues pressing quietly but persistently until one thing becomes clear. You cannot follow while holding on to yourself at the center. And once that realization settles in, even for a moment, something shifts again. Because now the question is no longer hidden. What are you still protecting? The spiritual mask that hides resistance. There is a form of resistance that does not look like resistance at all. It does not oppose truth directly, it does not reject what is right, and it certainly does not present itself as disobedience. Instead, it dresses itself in language that sounds correct, actions that appear sincere, and behaviors that resemble devotion. And because of that, it becomes almost impossible to detect. This is where spirituality itself can become a covering, not a rejection of truth, but a way of engaging with it that avoids its deepest demand. A person can pray, speak, teach, serve, and still remain untouched at the level where this passage speaks. They can build a life around faith, structure their identity around belief, and yet never fully surrender the one thing that continues to sit at the center, the self. And the most unsettling part is that nothing seems obviously wrong. From the outside, everything aligns. The words are right. The posture is right. The environment reinforces the appearance of growth. There is movement. There is consistency. There is even influence. But internally, something remains untouched. Because it is possible to replace surrender with activity. It is possible to substitute obedience with expression. It is possible to engage deeply with everything around truth while quietly avoiding what truth requires. And over time, this becomes a system. A way of living that allows you to feel connected without being transformed. You begin to rely on visible actions as evidence of alignment. You measure progress by consistency rather than by surrender. You find reassurance in what you do instead of confronting what you still hold on to. And this is where the mask becomes complete. Because it is no longer something you are aware of wearing, it becomes who you believe you are. But this passage does not respond to appearances. It does not measure external expression. It moves directly toward what is hidden, what is protected, what has remained untouched beneath everything else. And when it reaches that point, all forms of substitution begin to lose their value, because no amount of activity can replace surrender. No level of expression can substitute obedience. No structure of faith can override the absence of true alignment. And when that realization begins to settle in, even slightly, something uncomfortable starts to emerge. Because now it is no longer about what you have been doing. It becomes about what you have been avoiding. And that leads to a question that cannot be answered with actions alone. If everything you are doing still allows you to remain in control, have you truly let go of anything at all? The weight of a truth that cannot be negotiated. There comes a moment when truth stops feeling like an idea and begins to feel like a weight, not a burden placed on you from the outside, but a pressure that builds within as clarity increases and resistance remains. Because once something is fully seen, it cannot be unseen. And this is where negotiation begins to fail. Up until this point, there has always been room to adjust, reinterpret, delay. There has always been a way to create space between what is required and what is lived. But a truth like this does not allow itself to be divided into acceptable portions. It is whole. It is direct. And it does not respond to partial acceptance. This is where many try one last approach. Not to reject the truth, but to carry it in a reduced form. To hold on to it intellectually, to agree with it internally, but to apply it only where it feels possible. And at first, this seems reasonable. It feels honest. It feels like progress. But over time, something begins to break under that tension. Because truth that is only partially lived creates a constant internal conflict. You know what is required, but you also know what you are still holding on to. And that gap does not stay silent. It begins to press, to remind, to expose the distance between alignment and reality. This is the weight, not imposed, revealed. And the more clearly you see, the heavier it becomes. Not because the truth is changing, but because your awareness of it is no longer limited. You begin to recognize the areas where surrender has not happened, the places where control is still firmly held, the decisions that continue to orbit around self rather than submission. And this recognition cannot be managed forever. Because unlike other ideas, this truth does not fade with time. It does not lose urgency. It does not adapt to your pace. It remains present, steady, unchanging, creating a kind of pressure that cannot be ignored without consequence. And that consequence is not immediate failure. It is internal division, a state where you move forward externally but remain conflicted internally, where your actions suggest alignment but your core remains untouched, where your life continues but something essential remains unresolved. This is why the truth cannot be negotiated, because negotiation implies that something can be kept while something else is given. It suggests balance, compromise, adjustment. But this passage does not operate within those terms. It does not ask what you are willing to release. It reveals what must be released. And when that becomes clear, something shifts again. Because now the weight is no longer theoretical. It becomes personal. It becomes immediate. And it leads to a moment that cannot be delayed much longer. A moment where awareness turns into decision. The moment when there is no turning back. There is a point where everything you have heard, everything you have understood, everything you have quietly recognized begins to converge into a single, undeniable moment. It is not loud. It does not arrive with external pressure. But internally, it is unmistakable. You realize that you can no longer pretend you have not seen what has been revealed. This is the moment where delay loses its power. Up until now, there has always been time. Time to reflect, time to consider, time to process. But when truth reaches this level of clarity, time no longer functions as a buffer. It becomes a mirror, reflecting back the same question with increasing intensity. What are you going to do with what you now know? This is where many hesitate. Not because they are confused, but because they are clear. And clarity removes the comfort of indecision. You begin to see that remaining where you are is no longer neutral. It is a choice. Not moving forward is no longer passive. It is a response. Every moment of inaction starts to carry meaning because it reflects a decision to hold on rather than let go. And this is where the weight becomes immediate. Because now the tension is no longer about understanding or interpretation. It becomes about direction, about movement, about whether you are willing to step into something that will change the structure of your life, not just the surface of it. This is the threshold. And thresholds are uncomfortable because they separate what was from what must be. You cannot stand here indefinitely. You cannot remain divided forever. At some point, you either step forward into alignment or you step back into avoidance. And once you are aware of that, even stepping back feels different. It is no longer unconscious. It is no longer hidden. It is a deliberate return to what you now know is incomplete. This is why this moment is so critical. Because it exposes the reality that transformation is not blocked by lack of access, lack of knowledge, or lack of opportunity. It is defined by willingness. Willingness to release. Willingness to surrender. Willingness to follow without controlling the outcome. And that is where everything becomes real. Because once you cross this point, even internally, there is no returning to the same level of unawareness. You may choose not to act, but you will not be able to ignore what you have seen. And that awareness will remain, quiet, persistent, unresolved, until a decision is made. And now the question is no longer distant, it is immediate. If you cannot go back to what you were before, who are you going to become now? The difference between those who hear and those who surrender. At this stage, something becomes undeniably clear. The difference is no longer found in knowledge, exposure, or even sincerity. It is revealed in response. Two people can hear the same truth, feel the same weight, recognize the same clarity, and yet walk away in completely different directions. Not because one understood more than the other, but because one chose to respond differently to what was already understood. This is where the separation begins, not externally, internally. Those who hear will often remain close to truth. They will respect it, speak about it, even defend it. They will continue to grow in awareness, continue to engage, continue to build a structure around what they believe. And from the outside, it may appear that nothing is missing. But something remains unchanged at the center. Because hearing allows distance. It allows appreciation without surrender. It allows alignment in language without alignment in life. And over time, this creates a form of stability that feels like progress, but never fully becomes transformation. On the other side are those who surrender. Not perfectly, not without struggle, but decisively. They do not stand at a distance from truth. They allow it to move through them, to rearrange what needs to be rearranged, to remove what cannot remain, to redefine what must change. And this is where everything begins to shift. Because surrender does not add truth to your life. It places your life under truth. It changes the center. It removes control from where it has always been held and places it somewhere higher, somewhere that does not adjust to personal preference or internal negotiation. This is not comfortable. It is not predictable. It does not guarantee ease or immediate clarity in every step that follows. But it is real. And that is the difference. Those who hear can continue as they are, with increased awareness but unchanged direction. Those who surrender cannot. Because once surrender begins, even in its earliest form, it disrupts the previous structure. It creates movement that cannot be reversed without conscious resistance. It introduces a level of alignment that begins to affect everything else. And this is where the distinction becomes visible, not through words, but through life. Because hearing maintains control, surrender releases it. And now, standing at this point, the difference is no longer theoretical. It is personal. Because the question is no longer about what kind of truth you have encountered. It is about what kind of response you are choosing. And that leads directly to what very few are willing to accept. The narrow path that almost no one chooses. There is a path that remains open to everyone, yet is walked by very few. Not because it is hidden, not because access is restricted, but because what it requires stands in direct opposition to everything people naturally try to preserve. This is not about difficulty in the way most people define it. It is about direction, because the path that aligns with this truth does not run alongside comfort, control, or self-preservation. It moves against them. It requires decisions that do not make sense to a mind that is still trying to maintain balance between surrender and self-interest. And that is why so many admire it from a distance. They recognize its value, they respect its meaning, they even feel drawn to it, but they do not step into it, because stepping into it means leaving behind more than they are willing to release. This path is not crowded. It is not popular. It does not offer validation from those who are still negotiating with truth. In many cases, it will seem unnecessary, even extreme, to those who believe that alignment can exist without full surrender. But this path does not operate within that belief. It is narrow because it does not expand to accommodate resistance. It does not adjust itself to include partial obedience. It does not bend to allow both control and surrender to coexist. And this is where the decision becomes unmistakable. Because at this point, you can clearly see both directions. One path allows you to continue as you are, with increased understanding, refined language, and a sense of stability that feels secure. It asks very little beyond what you are already willing to give. The other path asks everything. Not in theory, in reality. It does not begin with perfection, but it does begin with a decision that removes negotiation. A decision that says you are no longer the center, no longer the authority, no longer the one determining the limits of your own surrender. And once that decision is made, even quietly, everything begins to shift. Priorities change, reactions change, desires begin to realign. Not instantly, not without struggle, but undeniably. Because the direction has changed, and direction determines everything. This is why so few choose it, not because they do not see it, but because they do, and they understand exactly what it will cost. And now, standing at this point, after everything that has been revealed, after every layer that has been uncovered, there is only one thing left that cannot be avoided: a final confrontation, a final decision, one that will define what happens next. The truth you can no longer ignore. Now everything stands exposed. Not the passage itself, not the words, not the interpretation, but you. Because after everything you have seen, everything you have understood, everything that has been brought to the surface, the distance between knowing and acting is no longer hidden. It is clear, it is present, it is personal. This is where the message stops being something you listen to and becomes something that confronts you directly. You cannot return to the same place of unawareness. You cannot pretend this was unclear. You cannot reduce this to something symbolic or distant. The truth has already moved too close for that, and now it is waiting, not for more understanding, not for more reflection, but for a response. This is the moment where everything becomes simple in a way that feels almost uncomfortable. Because all the complexity, all the reasoning, all the internal negotiation that once created space has now been removed. What remains is a choice, not a theoretical one, a real one. You either continue holding on to what has always been at the center, or you release it. You either maintain control and adjust truth around your life, or you allow truth to take its place and reshape your life completely. There is no third option hiding somewhere in between. And this is why this truth is so often ignored, not because it is difficult to understand, but because it is impossible to escape once it is fully seen. Because once it becomes real, it does not leave you the same. It does not allow you to move forward unchanged. It does not permit you to carry on as if nothing has shifted. It stays. Quiet, unyielding, present in every decision that follows. And from this point on, every step you take will reveal something. Either that you have chosen to follow, or that you have chosen to remain. There is no need for more explanation, no need for further clarification. Because at this level, truth does not need to be expanded. It needs to be answered. And now, in this moment, without noise, without pressure from the outside, without anything else to lean on, the question stands exactly where it has always been leading. What will you do with what you now know?